Welcome to LaserWriter Select Service Training. The LaserWriter Select is a high-quality 300 dpi postscript laser printer. Although similar in functionality to other Apple laser printers, the LaserWriter Select components often differ in location, physical design, and how they are removed and replaced. To accurately and efficiently service the LaserWriter Select, you must quickly locate and know the function of each module and major part, and correctly and safely take apart and reassemble the printer. You will see demonstration of these skills in this program. This tape is divided into 3 parts. Part 1, Parts and Functions, Print Cycle Initiation, and Part 2, Parts and Functions, Print Cycle Completion, locate and describe each component as it functions during the print cycle. And Part 3, Take Apart and Reassembly, guides you through the take apart and reassembly of the LaserWriter Select. To help you locate a specific part of the tape, the part number displays in the upper right corner of the screen. The LaserWriter Select has many components that are similar in function to those found in other laser printers, as well as some that differ in functionality, location, and physical design. This part of the tape identifies components generally in the sequence in which they function during the initiation phase of the print cycle. During the print cycle, a sheet of paper is picked up and moved through the printer, following a C-shaped path to the paper delivery tray. To help you locate a module or part, this orientation is used. This is the front of the printer, the right side, the back, the left side, the top, and the bottom. The LaserWriter Select printer has 3 customer-installed options: a 250-sheet feeder and base, a 500-sheet feeder and base, and a 50-sheet multi-purpose tray. The optional sheet feeders attach to the printer below the standard feeder assembly and paper cassette. The multi-purpose tray is installed above the manual feed tray. These options are software controlled. The main covers and most cables and screws have been removed to allow identification of modules and parts. We begin walking through the print cycle at the source of power, the AC power connector, and the on-off switch are located on the power supply at the back left corner of the printer. The power supply also contains the fuser assembly power switch. The power supply provides AC power to the fuser assembly and DC power to the DC controller. Immediately after switching on the printer, the fan begins to operate. The I/O controller board is located at the back and top of the printer. The I/O controller board is covered by the I/O shield. And is secured to the I/O controller mount. The I/O controller communicates with external devices and prints the user test page. The I/O controller board contains the cable connectors, ROM, and RAM. The LaserWriter Select is configured with one of 2 I/O controller boards: the LaserWriter Select 300 and the LaserWriter Select 310. The DC controller board is located below the I/O controller mount. The DC controller is the interface between the I/O controller and the print engine. The DC controller monitors and controls the print cycle, provides DC power to the printer, and prints the service test page. The service test page switch is located here and is accessed through this hole in the I/O controller mount. The DC controller board is secured to the DC controller mount. Immediately after switching on the printer, the DC controller conducts a self-test to determine if the necessary ready states exist. If all ready states exist, the DC controller initiates a print cycle. The I/O controller then sends a bitmap image of the user test page, stored in ROM, to the page buffer where it is held until it prints. The drive assembly is located on the right side of the printer. The drive assembly provides all drive for the printer and consists of the main motor and the drive transfer gears. The cassette tray is located at the bottom of the printer and holds up to 250 sheets of paper for automatic paper feed. Here is the cassette feeder assembly. This assembly feeds paper into the printer from the cassette tray. This is the cassette feeder board. The cassette feeder board contains the cassette size switch and the paper sensor. Here are the cassette size switch actuators. These actuators are activated by plastic cams or ridges on the side of the cassette tray. The cassette size switch determines the size of the cassette tray and if the tray is installed. Here is the paper sensing arm. This arm activates the paper sensor when the cassette tray is empty. These are the cassette pickup rollers. Activated by the cassette pickup solenoid, these rollers feed one sheet of paper at a time to the cassette feed roller. Here is the cassette feed roller. Activated by the cassette feed solenoid, this roller moves the sheet of paper to the paper feed roller, identified later. And here is the expansion feeder connector. This connector allows the optional sheet feeders to connect to the printer. This is the manual feed tray. This tray is used to feed paper into the printer one sheet at a time. This is the manual feed sensor assembly. Activated by the manual feed sensor arm, this sensor determines the presence of paper in the manual feed tray. Here is the pickup roller assembly. Activated by the manual feed pickup solenoid, this assembly picks up and moves the sheet of paper from the manual feed tray to the paper feed roller. The paper feed roller is located above the pickup roller assembly. This roller moves the sheet of paper toward the transfer roller and toner cartridge. Here is the paper charge deflector. This deflector removes any charge on the paper before it passes the transfer roller. The registration sensor and sensor arm are located on the paper charge deflector. When activated by the sensor arm, this sensor determines when paper is fed into the printer and sends a signal to the DC controller, which initiates the scanning of the image onto the photosensitive drum. This concludes Part 1, Parts and Functions Print Cycle Initiation. Please stop the tape. In this part of the tape, the components that function during the completion phase of the print cycle are identified and their functions described. The high-voltage power supply is located next to the DC controller board and mount. The high-voltage power supply provides high voltage to the toner cartridge and the transfer roller through the high-voltage contact assembly. The laser optic assembly is located below the high-voltage power supply. The laser optic assembly contains the laser diode and mirror, scanning motor and mirror, lenses, and the start of scan PCB that create the image on the photosensitive drum. At the end of a scan line, the start of scan PCB changes the laser beam reflected on it into an electrical signal which is sent to the DC controller. The DC controller then initiates the next scan line. This is the toner cartridge. It contains the primary roller, photosensitive drum, developing cylinder, drum cleaning unit, and the toner bin. The toner cartridge develops the image on the photosensitive drum before it transfers to the sheet of paper. This is the toner cartridge sensor assembly. When the toner cartridge is removed, the sensor arm deactivates switches S100 and S101, which cut power to the laser and signal the DC controller that the toner cartridge is not installed. Here is the transfer roller. The transfer roller applies a charge to the paper, causing the developed image to transfer from the photosensitive drum to the paper. The transfer guide is located above the transfer roller. It guides the sheet of paper as it moves toward the fuser assembly. The power switch lever is located next to the toner cartridge on the high-voltage contact assembly. When the front cover assembly opens, the power switch lever opens the fuser assembly power switch on the power supply and cuts off power to the fuser assembly. The fuser assembly is located above the toner cartridge. The combination of heat and pressure supplied by the fuser assembly fuses the image onto the sheet of paper. The exit roller assembly is located on the top back of the fuser assembly. The assembly moves the sheet of paper from the fuser assembly to the paper delivery tray. This is the paper delivery sensor lever. The delivery sensor is located here on the I/O controller mount. The paper delivery sensor lever activates the sensor as the page exits the fuser assembly. If the sheet of paper does not reach this sensor within a set period of time, a paper jam is determined to exist. This concludes Part 2, Parts and Functions, Print Cycle Completion. Please stop the tape. This part of the tape demonstrates how to take apart and reassemble the LaserWriter Select printer. Modules and major parts are removed and replaced in the sequence in which they are presented in the LaserWriter Select Take-Apart chapter on Apple's Service Source. For demonstration purposes, most screws and connectors have already been removed. Follow these guidelines when taking apart and reassembling the printer. Switch off the printer and disconnect the power cord. Be sure to use an ESD-safe work area and follow ESD precautions. and carefully follow the procedures, cautions, and tips presented on Apple Service Source. Begin take apart of your LaserWriter Select printer by removing the cassette tray and toner cartridge. Begin removing the covers by loosening the 2 captive screws. And lift off the top cover. Remove the side covers by first releasing the tab that secures the left side cover to the printer chassis. Then lift off the left side cover. Now release the tab that secures the right side cover to the printer chassis and lift off the right side cover. Remove the rear cover by removing the 2 mounting screws. Then lift off the rear cover. Begin removing the fuser assembly by removing the 3 screws that secure the fuser assembly to the printer chassis. Then lift out the fuser assembly. Start removing the I/O shield by removing the 8 mounting screws. And lifting the I/O shield from the chassis. Detach connector P119 from the paper delivery sensor. Detach connectors P50 and P51 on the 300 I/O controller board as shown here, or J3 and JP2 on the 310 I/O controller board. Finally, remove the 11 mounting screws. And lift the I/O controller board and I/O controller mount from the chassis. Begin removing the DC controller board and the DC controller mount by disconnecting the cables from the board. Remove the cables from the 2 cable retainers. Finally, remove the mounting screws. And lift out the DC controller board and the DC controller mount. Start removing the high voltage power supply by disconnecting the cables from the supply. Remove the cables from the cable retainer. Then remove the 5 screws that secure the high-voltage power supply to the printer chassis. And lift out the high-voltage power supply. Begin removing the power switch lever by removing the left top cover bracket mounting screw and lifting off the left top cover bracket. Detach the power switch lever from the front access door. Now remove the 2 screws that hold the power switch lever to the high voltage contact assembly and lift out the power switch lever. Remove the high-voltage contact assembly by removing the 2 screws that secure the assembly. And lifting it out of the printer. Begin removing the power supply by removing the 2 screws that secure connector P101 to the printer chassis. Remove the screws that hold the 2 ground wires to the power supply. Then remove the 3 screws that secure the power supply to the printer chassis. And lift out the power supply. Start removing the drive assembly by removing the 2 screws that fasten the right top cover bracket to the printer chassis. And lift off the right top cover bracket. Now remove the mounting screws. And pull out the drive assembly. Begin removing the transfer roller by grasping each end of the transfer roller and lifting it out of the printer. Grasp each end of the paper charge deflector and pull it off the pickup roller assembly. Detach connector P120 from the registration sensor and remove the single screw that secures the ground wire to the paper charge deflector. Then lift the paper charge deflector out of the printer. Now, remove the 2 screws that secure the pickup roller assembly to the front access door. And remove the pickup roller assembly. This completes LaserWriter Select Take Apart. Reassemble the LaserWriter Select by reversing the take-apart procedures. Begin replacing the pickup roller assembly by positioning the pickup roller assembly on the front access door. Replace the 2 screws that secure the pickup roller assembly to the door. Now, replace the single screw that secures the ground wire to the paper charge deflector. attach connector P120 to the registration sensor. Then press the paper charge deflector onto the pickup roller assembly. Next, position the transfer roller. Be sure the gear end is on the right. Then snap the transfer roller into place. Begin replacing the drive assembly by positioning the drive assembly on the printer chassis. Replace the mounting screws. Now, position the right top cover bracket and replace the two screws that fasten the right top cover bracket to the printer chassis. Start replacing the power supply by positioning the power supply on the chassis. Replace the three screws that secure the power supply. Replace the screws that hold the two ground wires, black and green, to the power supply. Finally, replace the two screws that secure connector P101 to the printer chassis. Begin replacing the high-voltage contact assembly by positioning the high-voltage contact assembly on the printer. Track the cables next to the power supply. Then replace the two screws that secure the high-voltage contact assembly. Start replacing the power switch lever by positioning the power switch lever on the high-voltage contact assembly. Replace the two screws that secure the power switch lever. Attach the power switch lever to the front access door. Finally, position the left top cover bracket and replace the left top cover bracket mounting screw. Begin replacing the high-voltage power supply by positioning the high-voltage power supply on the printer. Replace the 5 screws that secure the high-voltage power supply. Connect the cables to the high-voltage power supply. The cables are designed to attach only to the correct connectors. Finally, place the high-voltage power supply cables into the cable retainer. Begin replacing the DC controller board and the DC controller mount by positioning them on the printer chassis. Replace the mounting screw. Then connect the cables to the DC controller board and place them into the two cable retainers. Start replacing the I/O controller board and mount by positioning them on the printer chassis. Replace the 11 mounting screws. Attach connector P119 to the paper delivery sensor. Attach connectors P50 and P51 to the LaserWriter Select 300 I/O controller board, as shown here, or connectors J3 and JP2 to the LaserWriter Select 310 I/O controller board. Then replace the I/O shield and the 8 mounting screws. Begin replacing the fuser assembly by positioning it on the printer. Make sure that connector J101 on the fuser assembly properly contacts the connector receptacle on the printer chassis. Then replace the 3 screws that secure the fuser assembly. Replace the rear cover by positioning the rear cover on the printer chassis. Then replace the 2 mounting screws. Position the left side cover. And connect the tab that secures the left side cover to the printer chassis. Now position the right side cover and connect the tab that secures the right side cover to the printer chassis. Start replacing the top cover by positioning the top cover on the printer. Then replace the 2 captive screws. Complete reassembly by replacing the toner cartridge and the cassette tray. This completes Part 3, Take Apart and Reassembly, and concludes the tape. Please stop and rewind the tape.